The wind was a faithless friend in the high country, whispering through the pines one moment and howling like a predator the next. It was the howl that had driven Silas Blackwood indoors, but it was a different sound, thin and sharp as a sliver of ice that drew him back out. He stood on the porch of his cabin, a place built with his own hands from the timber of the valley itself, and listened. The scent of rain and damp earth filled his lungs, a smell he'd come to associate with the profound, bone-deep solitude of his life. He was a man carved from the same hard materials as the mountains that ringed his sanctuary. His face was a roadmap of long suns and hard winters, his hands calloused and capable, his eyes the color of a stormy sky, accustomed to scanning long distances and finding little of comfort. He had come to this valley to escape the noise of men and the ghosts of a war that had paid him in little more than a limp and a quiet rage. Here, there was only the honest conversation of the seasons. There was again a cry, not an animal. He knew the cougar's scream, the coyote's yip, the bear's guttural complaint. This was human, and it was close. He pulled his worn leather coat tighter, grabbed the rifle that leaned always by the door, and stepped off the porch. The ground, softened by a week of spring melt, gave under his worn boots. He moved with a woodsman's economy, his slight limp almost unnoticeable in the uneven terrain. He followed the sound toward the creek, a silver artery that gave the valley its life. The aspens were just beginning to show the pale green of new leaves, their white trunks stark against the darkening soil. He found her near the water's edge, half hidden in a thicket of willows. She was just a girl, maybe 16, maybe 17 summers old. Apache, by the look of her beaded deerskin dress, now torn and stained dark with mud and something else. Her black hair was a tangled mat, plastered to her face by fever sweat and rain. One leg was bent at an unnatural angle, wrapped in a crude, blood-soaked poultice of leaves and what looked like moss. Her eyes, when they flickered open and landed on him, were wide with a terror so pure it stole his breath. She was a cornered fawn staring down a wolf. Silas stopped, holding his rifle loosely in one hand, raising the other in the universal sign of peace. "Easy now," he said, his voice a low rumble, and used a speech. The sound was rough, like stones grinding together. She flinched, trying to push herself backward, a fresh wave of pain contorting her features. A soft moan escaped her lips, a sound of such profound misery it snagged on something inside him he'd thought long dead. He knew that look. He had seen it on the faces of young soldiers, of terrified villagers, of men on both sides of a line drawn in blood. It was the look of someone whose world had been shattered. He took a slow step forward, then another. He wasn't a man given to impulse. His life was a testament to caution, to thinking 3 steps ahead. Taking in a wounded Apache girl was not just an inconvenience. In this part of the country, at this time, it was a death warrant. There were bounties on scalps. There were patrols that shot first and asked questions never. To help her was to invite the very world he had fled to come crashing down upon his door. He should turn around, walk away, let nature take its course. It was the sensible thing to do. It was the safe thing to do. But then she spoke. Her lips were cracked, her voice a dry rasp, barely audible above the rustle of the willows. It was a single word, spoken not to him, but to the valley around them, to the sheltering mountains and the murmuring creek. It wasn't her tongue. It was a broken, desperate whisper of English, a word he hadn't realized he'd been searching for himself. "Home," she breathed, and her eyes fluttered closed. The word hung in the air between them, heavy and fragile. It was a prayer, a claim, a final, desperate plea. Silas looked from her pale, feverish face to the towering peaks that guarded the valley. This place was his refuge, his penance, his quiet end. He had never dared to call a home. It felt too much like a privilege he hadn't earned. But for this wounded child, fleeing from some unspeakable horror, this patch of wild land was the only sanctuary she could imagine. He knelt, the cold of the damp earth seeping through his trousers. The rifle lay forgotten beside him. He looked at the crude bandage on her leg, but the exhaustion etched into every line of her young face. The howls of the wind and the howls of his past seemed to fade, replaced by a singular, silent imperative. He couldn't leave her. He couldn't. With that one whispered word, she had laid claim not just to the valley, but to him. And in that moment, Silas Blackwood, a man who wanted nothing more than to be left alone, made a choice. He reached out, his rough hands surprisingly gentle, and decided to bring the world, and all its troubles, right into the heart of his solitude. The girl, he didn't know her name, and she hadn't offered it in the first few fever-racked days, was lighter than he'd expected. A bundle of sticks and spirit. Carrying her back to the cabin was a slow, arduous process. Her head lolled against his shoulder, her breathing shallow and hot against his neck. He moved with a grim determination, his own leg aching in protest, a familiar ghost reminding him of his own brush with mortality. He laid her on his own cot, the only soft place in the two-room cabin. The main room was a testament to his Spartan existence. A stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with a single chair, shelves holding a few tins of beans, sacks of flour and coffee, and a small, cherished collection of books. The other room was little more than a storage space for his traps, tools, and pelts. He worked quickly, his movements economical. He stoked the fire until it blazed, chasing the damp chill from the room. He filled a kettle with water from the rain barrel and set it to boil. Her leg was bad. The wound, a vicious gash on her calf, was inflamed and angry. It looked like it had been caused by a splintered rock or a sharp branch during a fall. He gently unwrapped the makeshift bandage, his stomach clenching at the sight. Infection had set in, the red streaks beginning their deadly crawl up her skin. Without cleaning, without proper care, she would lose the leg, or her life. He worked with a concentration that blocked out everything else. He tore strips from one of his own clean shirts, the soft, worn cotton, a small luxury. He washed the wound with hot water and the harsh lye soap he made himself, his touch as gentle as he could manage. She cried out in her delirium, her hands clenching the rough blanket. She spoke in her own tongue, a fast, fearful cadence of words he didn't understand, but whose meaning was clear enough. She was reliving whatever nightmare she had fled. He ground yarrow and willow bark, remedies learned from an old trapper long ago, into a paste and applied it to the wound before binding it tightly with a clean cloth. He brewed a tea from the willow bark, a bitter drink to fight the fever, and spent the better part of an hour coaxing small sips of it between her cracked lips. For 3 days, she drifted in a sea of fever. Silas barely slept. He sat in a chair by the cot, watching the rise and fall of her chest, listening to her ragged breaths. He kept the fire going, changed her bandages, and forced broth and willow tea into her. In her delirium, she would sometimes thrash, her eyes wide and unseeing. He would place a steadying hand on her shoulder, murmuring the same useless words of comfort he might offer a spooked horse. "Easy now. You're safe." He didn't know if she was safe. He was acutely aware of the risk. Every shadow that passed the window, every snap of a twig outside, sent a jolt of alarm through him. He was hiding a fugitive from a war he had tried to forget. He was harboring the enemy, some would say. He looked at her face, softened in sleep, the terror momentarily smoothed away, and saw not an enemy, but a child. Someone's daughter, someone's sister. On the 4th morning, the fever broke. He woke to find her watching him. Her eyes, dark and deep as a forest pool, were clear for the first time. The terror was still there, but it was banked, replaced by a quiet, wary assessment. He was sitting slumped in his chair, a blanket over his lap, the stubble on his jaw thick and gray. He must have looked like a grizzled old bear woken from hibernation. He pushed himself up, his joints protesting, and moved to the hearth to make coffee. He felt her eyes on him, tracking his every move. He didn't speak, sensing that silence was the best course. He poured a mug of coffee for himself and ladled some of the thin rabbit stew he'd made into a bowl for her. He sat on the small crate he was using as a bedside table, along with a cup of water. He didn't push it on her, just left it within her reach. Then he sat back down at his table and drank his coffee, pretending to be absorbed by the grain of the wood. Minutes passed, stretching into a long, silent conversation. Finally, he heard a small sound, the scrape of the spoon against the bowl. He didn't look, didn't want to spook her, but a knot of tension in his chest eased. She was eating. It was a start. The days that followed fell into a quiet rhythm, a routine of healing. Silas would tend to his chores, chopping wood, checking his snares, tending the small garden he kept behind the cabin. She in turn would watch. Her name, he learned, was Nita. She offered it one afternoon as he was changing her bandage. He had pointed to his own chest. Silas, she had watched him for a long moment before touching her own, her voice soft as milkweed fluff. Nita, the name suited her. It was simple and strong. Language was a wall between them, but they found other ways to communicate. A gesture, an expression, a shared glance. He taught her the English words for things in the cabin: fire, water, spoon, blanket. She learned quickly, her mind a thirsty sponge. She had a quiet dignity that impressed him. She never complained, though he knew her leg must be causing her constant pain. She would accept his help with a solemn nod, her dark eyes conveying a gratitude that words could not. As she grew stronger, she began to move about the cabin, first with a crutch he fashioned for her from a sturdy branch, then with a pronounced limp that mirrored his own. A match set, he thought with a flicker of grim humor. She began to help in small ways. She would mend his torn shirt with a skill that surprised him, her stitches tiny and perfect. She would grind his coffee beans or knead the dough for his daily bread, her hands moving with an innate knowledge. The cabin, once just a shell for his solitude, began to feel different. Warmer, quieter, yet less empty. One afternoon, he returned from checking a line of traps along the ridge to find a strange, savory smell filling the air. Nita was by the fire, stirring his big iron pot. She had taken some of his dried venison and combined it with wild onions and a pungent root he didn't recognize, which she must have dug up near the creek. The resulting stew was richer and more flavorful than anything he had ever made himself. She watched him nervously as he took the first bite. He met her gaze and gave a slow, deliberate nod of approval. A small, tentative smile touched her lips for the very first time. It was like watching a rare flower bloom in the snow. The valley was her true medicine. Once she was able to walk outside, a profound change came over her. The wariness in her eyes began to be replaced by a deep, abiding peace. She seemed to draw strength from the land itself. She would sit for hours on the porch, watching the clouds drift over the peaks, her face tilted up to the sun. She showed him things he had never noticed in his years there. The patch of wild mint growing by the spring. The way the hawks used the thermal updrafts along the cliff face. The best places to find sweet berries. This wasn't just a patch of dirt to her. It was a living, breathing entity. It was her home. The outside world remained a distant threat, a low hum on the edge of his consciousness. He made a necessary trip to the nearest settlement, a dusty collection of buildings called Purgatory Flats, for salt, ammunition, and flour. He left Nita with a rifle and a firm instruction, conveyed through gestures, to hide if anyone came near. The trip filled him with a low-grade dread. The town was a place of hard men and harder gossip. As he was loading his supplies onto his mule, the town's blacksmith, a burly man named Jebediah Stone, ambled over. "Ain't seen you in a coon's age, Blackwood," Stone said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near Silas's boot. "Thought maybe a bear got you." "Still here," Silas grunted, not encouraging conversation. "Heard some commotion up your way a month or two back," Stone pressed, his eyes narrowed with idle curiosity. "Army patrol chasing some renegade Apache. Said they scattered a whole family band up in the high country. Nasty business." Silas's blood ran cold. He focused on cinching a rope, his knuckles white. "Didn't hear a thing. It's quiet in my valley." "Yell, it ain't gonna be quiet for long," Stone said, leaning in conspiratorially. "Word is Bartholomew Thorne bought up the whole damn territory. Every parcel from here to the granite spires." The name meant nothing to Silas, but the implications hit him like a physical blow. "Bought it? It's government land. Homestead land." Stone laughed, a harsh, grating sound. Not when a man with a railroad wants it. Thorne's running his new line straight through. Surveyors have been all over the place. They say he's got deeds signed in Washington. Can't fight that kind of money, Blackwood. Progress is coming, whether we like it or not. Silas finished his knots, his mind reeling. He gave Stone a curt nod and led his mule out of town, the dust of Purgatory Flats feeling like a shroud. The whole way back to the valley, the blacksmith's words echoed in his head. Progress is coming. It sounded like a death knell. He topped the final ridge and looked down at his valley. From up here, it was a perfect bowl of green and gold, cradled by the granite mountains. A plume of smoke rose from his cabin's chimney, a thin, steady column that signaled life and warmth. And Nita, it signaled home. A cold dread, colder than any winter snow, settled in his gut. The faceless man, Bartholomew Thorne, hadn't just bought a stretch of land. He had bought their sanctuary. And Silas knew, with a certainty that made him ache, that this was a fight he couldn't win. The first sign of the invasion came 2 weeks later. It wasn't an army, but 3 men on horseback leading a pack mule. They were dressed not as soldiers or cowboys, but in practical, durable clothes that spoke of long days spent walking the earth. Surveyors. Silas saw them from the ridge where he'd been tracking a deer. He watched as they dismounted at the mouth of the valley and began to set up their instruments. A transit, a tripod, a long measuring chain. They moved with an unhurried, professional air that was somehow more menacing than open aggression. They were the calm, methodical vanguard of destruction. He made his way back to the cabin, his heart a heavy stone in his chest. Nita was outside, sitting on the porch step, mending one of his shirts. She looked up as he approached, her hands stilling. She could read him like a map, could sense the disturbance in him without a word being spoken. Her eyes darted toward the valley entrance, her hunter's instincts sensing a foreign presence. "Stay inside," he said, the words stark and commanding. He pointed to the cabin, then held up a hand. "Aye." She hesitated, her brow furrowed with concern. But she saw the hard set of his jaw and obeyed, slipping silently into the cabin and pulling the heavy wooden door almost closed, leaving only a sliver through which to watch. Silas walked out to meet them. He didn't take his rifle, a conscious choice. This wasn't a fight to be won with powder and lead. Not yet, anyway. He met the men in the middle of the wide, grassy meadow that served as the valley's floor. The sun was warm on his back, and the air was sweet with the scent of clover and wild thyme. It felt like a desecration. The lead surveyor, a man with a neat brown beard and spectacles, looked up from his notebook. "Afternoon," he said, his tone polite, businesslike. "Didn't realize anyone was living up in here. This your claim?" "I live here," Silas said, his voice flat. He planted his feet, feeling the solid earth beneath him, as if he could hold onto it through the soles of his boots. "Right. Well, my name is Harmon. We're with the Transcontinental Pacific Railroad," the man said, as if the name itself were a royal decree. "We're surveying the route for the new main line. We'll be working in this valley for the next few days." "This is homestead land," Silas stated, echoing his own protest from town. It sounded feeble even to his own ears. Harmon gave a small, apologetic shrug. It was. The entire parcel, from the river to the mountains, was purchased by Mr. Bartholomew Thorne last month. All legal and above board. He holds the title free and clear. "I have the paperwork. If you'd like to see it," he gestured to a leather satchel on his mule. "I don't need to see it," Silas said, his gaze sweeping over the pristine valley. He could already imagine it. A great, raw scar torn through the meadow. The thunder of the engine replacing the sound of the wind. "You can't run a train through here." Harmon sighed, a man weary of dealing with obstinate squatters. "Sir, with all due respect, Mr. Thorne can and will run his train through here. Our job is just to mark the path. We'll try to stay out of your way as much as possible. You'll receive an official notice of eviction in due course. But for now, we have a job to do." He turned back to his transit, a clear dismissal. The other 2 men were already unreeling their chain, driving a wooden stake with a red flag into the soft earth. The sound of the hammer striking the wood was unnaturally loud in the quiet air. Each blow was a nail in the coffin of his piece. Silas stood there for a long moment, a useless sentinel. He was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and outclassed by a power he couldn't even see. He was just one man with a bad leg and a troubled past, standing against the relentless march of money and iron. There was nothing he could do. He turned and walked back toward the cabin. The red flag on the stake fluttered in the breeze, a small, arrogant wound on the landscape. As he got closer, he saw Nita's face in the dark sliver of the doorway. Her eyes weren't filled with the frantic terror he had first seen in them. They were filled with a fierce, protective anger. She wasn't looking at him. She was staring past him at the men and their red flag. He had taken her in to save her, to give her a safe place to heal. Now he realized he had only led her to a different kind of slaughter, a slower, more methodical one. Looking at the defiance in her gaze, he felt a flicker of his own banked rage stir. His choice was no longer just about protecting her. It was about defending the only thing either of them had left to call home. The days that followed were a slow torment. The surveyors became a constant, unwelcome presence. Their voices, carried on the wind, were a persistent intrusion. The rhythmic clang of their hammer-driving stakes was the valley's new, hated heartbeat. They were meticulous, relentless. They marked a wide, straight path directly through the heart of the meadow, passing less than 100 yards from Silas's cabin. Silas and Nita retreated into a world of watchful silence. They spoke little, but a new kind of communication flowed between them, an alliance forged in the face of a common enemy. He would watch the men from the tree line, his fists clenched, a feeling of impotent fury churning in his gut. Nita would watch them from the cabin window, her face a mask of stoicism that could not entirely hide the grief in her eyes. The valley was shrinking, its sacred silence shattered. The wildlife grew skittish. The deer herds moved higher into the mountains, and the birdsong seemed more frantic, less joyful. He taught her more English. Practical words. Railroad. Surveyors. Danger. Wait. She taught him things in return, without words. She showed him how to track the surveyors by the signs they left. A broken branch, a scuffed patch of moss, the faint scent of their pipe tobacco. She had an awareness of the land that was as much a part of her as her own breath. She was not a guest in this valley. She was an extension of it. To harm the land was to harm her. One evening, as the sun bled crimson and gold behind the western peaks, she did something that shifted the dynamic between them forever. Silas was sitting at his table, staring blankly at a map of the territory he'd bought in town, trying to find some flaw, some loophole, some forgotten claim that might give him grounds to fight. It was a fool's errand. Nita came and stood beside him. She pointed a slender finger at the cabin, then at her own chest. "Nita," she said. Then she pointed at the cabin again, and then at his chest. "Silas," she paused, then swept her hand in a wide, graceful arc that encompassed the entire room, the porch outside, the meadow, the mountains. She looked him directly in the eye, her gaze unwavering, and said the words she had whispered in her fever dream. But this time it was clear, strong, and possessive. Home. It wasn't a plea anymore. It was a declaration, a statement of fact. She wasn't his guest. He wasn't her protector. They were partners in this place. The invisible wall of pity and responsibility that he had built around himself crumbled. He was no longer just sheltering a wounded girl. He was defending their shared life. The surveyors finished their work and left, leaving behind their trail of red flag stakes like a pox upon the meadow. A week of fragile peace settled back over the valley, but it was a tainted peace, pregnant with the knowledge of what was to come. Silas used the time to fortify his claim, not in law, but in spirit. He and Nita worked side by side. They expanded her small garden, planting beans and squash. He repaired the roof of the cabin. They fell into a domestic rhythm that felt both brand new and ancient. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the vast, velvet sky, the silence between them comfortable, companionable. He started to feel a crack in the wall of his own solitude, a dangerous warmth seeping in. He was beginning to fear not the railroad, but the thought of what his life would be like if Nita were ever to leave. The next wave of the invasion was more formidable. A crew of 12 men arrived, led by a foreman who was the physical embodiment of the railroad's brutal efficiency. His name was Calloway, a thick-necked man with a florid face and eyes as cold and gray as river stones. He rode a big, powerful gelding and carried a pistol strapped high and tied on his hip. His crew was rough, a mix of Irishmen, Chinese laborers, and hard-bitten Americans, all there to do a job and get paid. They made their camp at the mouth of the valley, a sprawling, messy affair of tents and cook fires. The noise was constant, the braying of mules, the shouts of men, the ring of axes as they began to clear the trees along the surveyed path. The destruction had begun in earnest. Calloway rode up to the cabin on his second day. He didn't dismount, looking down at Silas from the saddle in a clear posture of authority. Nita had already vanished inside, as silent as a ghost. "You're Blackwood," Calloway stated. It wasn't a question. "I am," Silas said, standing on his porch, forcing himself to remain calm. "Got this for you," Calloway said, pulling a folded document from his coat. He tossed it onto the porch. It landed with a soft, final thud. "Official notice. You've got 30 days to vacate the premises. All structures, livestock, and personal property. After that, anything left here becomes property of the Transcontinental Pacific Railroad, to be disposed of as we see fit." Silas didn't pick it up. He stared at Calloway, his eyes burning. "This is my home." Calloway almost smiled. It was a contemptuous twitch of his lips. "It's a patch of dirt, old man, and it belongs to Mr. Thorne now. Don't make this difficult. I've got a schedule to keep." His gaze flickered to the cabin door, which was not quite shut. "I hear you're keeping company. A little Apache stray." His voice lowered, taking on a greasy, insinuating tone. "The Army pays a bounty for those. Might be enough to set yourself up somewhere else. Just a thought." The suggestion was so vile, so obscene, that for a moment Silas couldn't breathe. A red haze clouded his vision. His hand twitched, instinctively reaching for the rifle that wasn't there. He wanted nothing more than to drag this man from his horse and beat the smug cruelty from his face. But he knew that was a death sentence for him and for Nita. He forced the rage down, banking it like a dangerous fire. "Get off my land," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Calloway chuckled. "Not your land, Blackwood. Not anymore." He wheeled his horse around, kicking up clods of dirt. 30 days, he called back over his shoulder. "The clock is ticking." Silas watched him go, his body rigid with a fury so profound it left him shaking. He bent down and picked up the paper. It was cold and official, full of legal jargon that all meant the same thing: get out or be destroyed. He went inside. The cabin was dim and silent. Nita stood by the hearth, her back to him, her shoulders tense. She had heard. She had to have heard. He placed a notice on the table, the paper seeming to poison the very air in the room. He felt a despair so heavy it threatened to crush him. He had faced cannon fire and cavalry charges. He had survived starvation and winter storms. But he didn't know how to fight this. How did a man fight a piece of paper? How did he fight a railroad? He sank into his chair, the weight of his failure pressing down on him. He had offered her a home only to lead her to eviction. He had promised her safety only to expose her to men like Calloway. He had failed. He felt a light touch on his shoulder. Nita, she had come to stand behind him. Her hand was small and warm on the rough fabric of his shirt. She didn't speak. She just stood there, her presence a silent testament of solidarity. He wasn't alone in this fight. They were in it together. He reached up and covered her hand with his own, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers. The clock was ticking, but for the first time, he felt he wasn't just fighting against something. He was fighting for someone, and that, he thought, might make all the difference. The 30 days began to dwindle, each sunset a stark reminder of their dwindling time. The valley floor was transformed into a scene of methodical chaos. The clean, straight line of red flags became a wide, muddy scar. The sound of axes was replaced by the groan of crosscut saws and the shouts of the mule teams dragging felled timber. The air, once pure and pine-scented, was now often hazed with smoke from the crew's cook fires and the burning of cleared brush. It was a constant, grinding assault on the senses, an erosion of the peace that had once defined the place. Silas fell into a state of quiet desperation. He spent his days watching, learning the crew's routines, the foreman Calloway's habits. He saw the way the men worked, the casual brutality with which they remade the land to suit their purpose. He saw the divisions among them. The Chinese crew kept separate, given the hardest, most dangerous work, treated with a casual disdain by Calloway and the white laborers. There was no brotherhood there, only a shared hardship for a wage. Nita, too, was a watcher, but she watched differently. She watched the land's reaction to the assault. She pointed out to Silas how the creek was beginning to run muddy with topsoil from the cleared slopes, how the displaced animals were moving into the narrower side canyons, creating new and unfamiliar territories. She was reading the story of the valley's slow death. Their shared existence in the cabin deepened, honed by the external pressure. The small space became their fortress. In the evenings, with the door barred and the curtains drawn against the flickering lights of the work camp, they would sit in the warm glow of the firelight. The language barrier was dissolving piece by piece. He would read to her from his books, Shakespeare, the Bible, a tattered volume of poetry. He wasn't sure how much she understood of the complex language, but she listened with a fierce intensity, her dark eyes reflecting the flames, picking out words she knew: love, night, star, heart. In return, she shared her own stories, not with words, but with her hands. She would use a piece of charcoal on a smooth plank of wood to draw. She drew her family, stick figures around a fire. She drew the monstrous shapes of soldiers on horseback, their faces grim and featureless. And she drew the valley, over and over again, the mountains like protective arms, the creek a silver lifeline. In her drawings, his cabin was always there, a small, solid square with a curl of smoke rising from the chimney. One night, a storm rolled in, a furious, late-spring tempest that unleashed a torrent of rain. The wind shrieked, and thunder cannonaded off the high peaks. The noise from the work camp was silenced, swallowed by the greater fury of the storm. Inside the cabin, it was just the two of them, safe and dry. The shared danger of the storm felt like a reprieve from a human threat outside. Nita was sitting on the hearth, staring into the fire. Silas was cleaning his rifle, the familiar, methodical movements of comfort. "Calloway," Nita said, the name a harsh stone in her soft voice. "He will make us leave." Silas's hand stilled. "I won't let him." The words sounded brave, but they felt hollow. She turned to look at him, her expression unreadable in the flickering light. "My people, they fought. They had courage. But the soldiers had more guns. They took the land. They always take the land." It was the most she had ever spoken of her past. He could hear the weight of generations of loss in her voice. He had been one of those soldiers. Not in her specific fight, perhaps, but in the same war, the same relentless conquest. The old guilt, never far from the surface, twisted in his gut. He had come to this valley to escape that legacy, and now it had followed him here, personified by Calloway and his crew. "This time is different," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name. He didn't know if he believed it, but he needed her too. The storm raged all night. In the morning, a thick mist shrouded the valley, muffling all sound. When it finally began to burn off under the mid-morning sun, the scene it revealed was one of devastation. The creek, normally a placid, gentle stream, had become a raging, chocolate-brown torrent. It had overflowed its banks, flooding the meadow. The railroad's work camp was a disaster zone. Tents were submerged, supplies washed away, and the newly graded track bed was a river of mud. Silas and Nita stood on the porch, watching. The railroad men were struggling in the knee-deep water, trying to salvage their equipment. Their progress had been not just halted, but reversed. "The valley fights back," Nita whispered, a note of awe in her voice. But Silas knew it was a temporary victory. The water would recede. The men would rebuild. The machine would grind on. The storm had bought them time, nothing more. And now they had less than 2 weeks left. The flood set Calloway's schedule back significantly, and his mood, already foul, turned venomous. He drove his men harder, his voice a constant, angry bark that echoed across the valley. The work became more dangerous as they rushed to make up for lost time. There was an accident. One of the Chinese laborers, a young man no older than Nita, lost his footing on a muddy slope and was crushed by a load of falling timber. Silas saw it happen through his spyglass. He saw the brief, chaotic flurry of activity, the way Calloway barely gave the incident a moment's pause before ordering the other men back to work. They buried the boy in a shallow, unmarked grave on the hillside, a footnote in the ledger of progress. That evening, Nita disappeared. Silas came in from securing his mule and found the cabin empty. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. He grabbed his rifle and ran outside, calling her name. He searched the woods near the cabin, his mind racing with terrible possibilities. Had Calloway taken her? Had she run away, deciding he couldn't protect her? He finally found her up on the hillside, not far from the fresh grave. She had built a small mound of stones over the spot, and on top, she had placed a small, intricate bundle of pine needles and the bright feathers of a blue jay. It was a gesture of respect, a quiet act of defiance against the callousness of the world. She was mourning a stranger, a boy who represented her own fragile place in this land. He stood behind her, his panic slowly subsiding, replaced by a wave of profound admiration. She possessed a core of compassion and grace that the world had tried and failed to extinguish. "Nita," he said softly. She looked up, her eyes wet with unshed tears. "They do not care," she said. "A life is like a tree to them, something to be cleared from the path." He had no answer for that, because it was the truth. He stood with her in silence as the light faded, the two of them paying tribute to a life that had been deemed worthless by the men who held all the power. As they walked back to the cabin in the deepening twilight, he knew he couldn't just watch anymore. Passivity was a form of surrender. He had to do something, even if it was foolish, even if it was doomed. He had to honor the courage of the girl walking beside him. That night, under the cover of a moonless sky, Silas became a saboteur. He moved like a ghost through the woods, his knowledge of the terrain his greatest weapon. He didn't use dynamite or fire. He wasn't interested in killing. He was interested in delay, in frustration. He loosened the wheels on a supply wagon. He moved survey stakes, shifting the line by a few crucial, confusing feet. He used his trapping skills to rig a series of simple but effective deadfalls, not to harm, but to block the cleared path with heavy logs. They were small acts, pinpricks against a giant, but they were something. They were resistance. It worked for a time. Calloway was furious. Days were lost as his crew had to resurvey the line, clear the new blockages, and repair the wagon. He knew it was sabotage, and he knew who was responsible. He rode to the cabin again, his face a mask of thunder. "I don't have proof, Blackwood," he snarled, remaining in the saddle while Silas stood his ground on the porch. "But I know it's you. You and that little savage you're hiding. You pull one more stunt, and I'll burn this shack to the ground with you both inside it. The 30 days are almost up. I'd suggest you start packing." The threat hung in the air, ugly and real. After Calloway left, Nita came out onto the porch. She had been listening. "He will do it," she said, her voice a flat statement of fact. "I know," Silas said. The end was coming. He could feel it closing in, the options narrowing until there was only one left, a final, desperate stand. The final day dawned clear and cold. A brilliant, merciless blue sky stretched over a valley that no longer felt like home. It felt like a battlefield. The sounds of the work crew were louder today, more aggressive. They had reached the last stretch of clearing before the meadow where the cabin stood. Today, they would begin blasting the rock face of the narrow pass that opened into the valley proper, widening it for the tracks. Silas had spent the night cleaning his rifle and his pistol, oiling the mechanisms until they moved with lethal smoothness. He had no illusions. He was one man against a dozen, maybe more, but he would not let them take Nita. He would not let them bulldoze his home without a fight. He would make them pay a price for this small patch of earth. He was sitting at the table, checking his ammunition, when Nita spoke. She had been unnaturally quiet all morning, moving about the cabin with a strange, intense purpose. "Silas," she said. He looked up. She was standing before him, holding something out to him. It was one of her charcoal drawings, this one more detail than the others. It showed the pass, the narrow cut in the rock the crew was preparing to blast. But she had drawn other things. She had drawn fine, spidery lines running through the rock formation. And she had drawn the symbol for water, a series of wavy lines, at the very top of the cliff, in a place he'd never inspected closely. "What is this?" he asked, taking the drawing from her. She pointed to the lines in the rock. "Weak," she said. "This stone is weak." Like a broken plate, she struggled for the word, her hands making a crumbling motion. "It will all fall." Then she pointed to the top of the cliff, to the symbol for water. "My grandfather," he showed me, "when I was a little girl. Before." Her voice trailed off. She took a breath and continued, her focus absolute. "There is a spring, hidden, inside the mountain. The water makes the rock weak. If they use the black powder—" She made a large, explosive gesture with her hands, then a sweeping motion downwards. "All of it. The whole mountain will fall. It will block the valley forever." Silas stared at the drawing, his mind racing. A hidden spring. Unstable rock. He had seen rock like that before, rotten, water-seeped granite that looked solid but would crumble under pressure. If she was right, a major blast could trigger a landslide of catastrophic proportions. It wouldn't just widen the pass, it would bury it. It would destroy the crew, their equipment, and block the path of the railroad permanently. But it would also change the valley forever, sealing it off. "You're sure?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded, her eyes burning with conviction. "It is a sacred place, a place of power. It should not be disturbed." A new plan began to form in his mind, desperate and incredibly risky. It was not a plan of violence, but of knowledge. A confrontation was unavoidable, but maybe it didn't have to be a fatal one. He looked at Nita, at the fierce intelligence in her eyes. She had just handed him their only weapon. Not a gun, but the truth of the land itself. "All right," he said, pushing back from the table. He left the rifle and the pistol where they lay. "Let's go talk to Mr. Calloway." The air at the worksite was thick with tension and the acrid smell of black powder. The crew had drilled a series of deep holes into the rock face of the pass. Men were carefully tamping charges of dynamite and running fuses. Calloway stood overseeing the operation, his face impatient, eager for the blast that would signal his victory over this stubborn piece of wilderness. Silas and Nita walked out of the woods and into the cleared area. Their appearance caused an immediate stir. The men stopped working, turning to stare. They were an unlikely sight. The grizzled, limping homesteader and the young Apache woman, walking side by side, unarmed, into the heart of the enemy camp. Calloway turned, his face darkening with fury when he saw them. "Blackwood, I gave you a warning. I told you to stay away." He strode toward them, his hand dropping to the butt of his pistol. "This is your last mistake. We're not here to make trouble, Calloway," Silas said, his voice calm and steady, projecting over the nervous silence. He stopped a respectful distance away, holding his empty hands out to his sides. "We're here to stop you from killing your own men." Calloway laughed, a short, ugly bark. "What in God's name are you talking about?" "This rock," Silas said, gesturing toward the cliff face. "It's unstable. You set off those charges, you're not just going to widen the pass. You're going to bring the whole damned mountain down on top of us." A few of the workers glanced nervously from Silas to the cliff and back again. Calloway's eyes narrowed. "That's the craziest thing I've ever heard. It's granite, solid as the day God made it. Now get out of here before I have you thrown out." "He's telling the truth," a soft voice said. It was Nita. She stepped forward, standing beside Silas, her small frame radiating an unshakable authority. All eyes turned to her. She was no longer a shy, hidden creature. She was a woman defending her home. She pointed to a spot high up on the cliff face, a place that looked no different from the rest to the untrained eye. "There," she said, her English clear and strong. "There is a dark line in the rock, and higher you can see the dampness. You can see the green moss, even in this dry season. There's a spring inside the mountain. The water has been eating the stone for 1,000 years. It is rotten, hollow." Calloway stared at her, then followed her finger, his expression a mixture of contempt and a flicker of uncertainty. He couldn't dismiss it out of hand. A landslide would be a disaster for the railroad, a delay that would cost Thorne a fortune and Calloway his job. "She's a savage," he spat, his bravado returning. "What would she know about geology?" "She knows this mountain," Silas countered, his voice ringing with conviction. "She knows every rock and every tree in it. She knows it better than your surveyors, better than your engineers, and a damn sight better than you. Are you willing to bet your life, and the lives of all your men, that she's wrong?" The challenge hung in the air. The crewmen were muttering now, their confidence shaken. They looked at the cliff, at the fuses, at their foreman. They were paid to work, not to be buried alive. Calloway was trapped. To back down was to admit defeat, to concede authority to a homesteader and an Apache girl. But to proceed was to take a terrible risk. His face was purple with rage and indecision. "It's a trick," he roared, trying to regain control. "A lie to slow us down. Light the fuses." No one moved. The men looked at each other, their fear overriding their obedience. "I said, light the fuses," Calloway bellowed, pulling his pistol from its holster. He leveled it not at Silas, but the nearest of his own men. "Or by God, I'll start shooting right here." In that moment, Nita did something extraordinary. She walked forward past Silas directly toward the cliff face. She stopped at its base and placed her palm flat against the cold, gray stone, as if greeting an old friend. She then bent down, picked up a loose piece of rock from the ground, and held it out. "Look," she said, her voice carrying in the tense silence. She turned the rock over in her hands. It was pitted and crumbly, with dark, wet veins running through it. She squeezed it with both hands, and with a gritty sound, the rock broke apart, crumbling into fragments and dust in her palms. A collective gasp went through the crew. It was proof, undeniable and visceral. The stone was rotten. Calloway stared at the dust falling from Nita's hands, his face ashen. His bluff was called, his authority shattered. The pistol in his hand wavered. He had been defeated not by force, but by truth. He couldn't give the order to fire the fuses now. It would be a death sentence, and his men would never obey it. He couldn't shoot a man for refusing to commit suicide. He let out a strangled cry of pure frustration, a sound of an empire being thwarted by a handful of dust. He slowly, hatefully, lowered the pistol and jammed it back into its holster. "Pack it up," he snarled at his men, his voice choked with humiliation. "We're done here. We'll have to find another way around." The words were the sweetest music Silas had ever heard. The crew, visibly relieved, began to move, their movements brisk and efficient as they started dismantling the charges and coiling the fuses. The immediate threat was over. The valley, for now, was safe. Silas walked over to Nita, who was still standing at the base of the cliff, her hand resting on the stone. He stood beside her, looking not at the defeated foreman or the departing crew, but at her. She had saved them. She had saved the valley. Her quiet strength, her deep knowledge, her unshakable courage. They had achieved what his guns and his rage never could. She turned to him, a slow, radiant smile spreading across her face. It was a smile of relief, of triumph, of belonging. In that moment, the last of the barriers between them dissolved. He was no longer her rescuer, and she was no longer his ward. They were partners. They were equals. They were home. He reached out and took her hand, his rough, calloused fingers lacing through hers. Together, they stood and watched as the invaders packed up their tools of destruction and retreated from the valley they had failed to conquer. The silence that settled in their wake was profound, broken only by the sound of the wind, whispering through the pines like a sigh of relief. In the days that followed, a deep and settled peace returned to the valley. The scars on the landscape remained, the cleared timber, the muddy track bed, but they were no longer signs of an impending doom. They were monuments to a victory won. The creek ran clear again, and slowly, cautiously, the wildlife began to return from the high country. The railroad did not come back. Word trickled back to Silas months later, on another rare trip to Purgatory Flats. Bartholomew Thorne, enraged by the costly delay and the geological report that confirmed the pass was unusable, had rerouted his line 30 miles to the south, a path that was longer and far more expensive. The valley had been deemed worthless, an obstacle, and was promptly forgotten by the world of money and progress. Silas and Nita reclaimed their home. They worked together, their movements falling into a rhythm of shared purpose and quiet affection. They planted a larger garden in the rich soil the flood had left behind. He taught her to read and write, and she would sit for hours with his books, her brow furrowed in concentration, the world of words opening up to her. She, in turn, continued to teach him the language of the valley, the subtle signs of the changing seasons, the names of the stars in her own tongue. The cabin ceased to be a shelter and became their shared space. Her touches were everywhere. In the clay pots she fashioned and filled with wildflowers, in the woven mats on the floor, in the savory smell of the stews she simmered over the fire. His solitude, once a shield, had been transformed into a partnership so natural it felt as if it had always been there. One crisp autumn afternoon, they were sitting on the porch, watching the aspens on the far hillsides blaze a brilliant, fiery gold. The air was clean and sharp, carrying the promise of the coming winter. Nita was humming a soft, melodic tune as she mended one of his shirts, her stitches small and perfect. Silas watched her, his heart full of a quiet, powerful emotion he finally had the courage to name. It was love, a love born not of passion or romance in the storybook sense, but forged in shared hardship, mutual respect, and a profound, grounding connection to this small piece of the earth. He looked at her, at the way the sun caught the blue-black shine of her hair, at the peaceful concentration on her face, and he knew his life had begun again, here in this valley. He had come here to die, in a way, to let the quiet years sand down the rough edges of his soul until there was nothing left. Instead, she had arrived, a wounded girl whispering of home, and had shown him how to live. He had not saved her. They had saved each other. He looked out at the majestic, silent mountains that stood guard around their sanctuary, and he felt a sense of peace so complete it was almost overwhelming. This was his place. This was his partner. This was his home, and it was more than he had ever dared to hope for. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.